was saying, last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Professor Joyce Goodfriend from the University of Denver, who is the author of a number of books and numerous articles on colonial New York and on New Netherland. Most recently, co-editor of Going Dutch, Dutch Presence in America, 1609-2009, Revisiting New Netherland, New Perspectives in Early Dutch America, both from Brill, and she's the author of Before the Melting Pot, Society and Culture in Colonial New York City, 1664-1730. So Joyce.
Two ships, the Rosenboom, the Rose Tree, and the Moosh, the Sparrow. Each sailed into New Amsterdam's magnificent harbor, loaded with people eager to disembark after an arduous and perilous voyage. The passengers on the Rosenboom, which arrived in 1663, are enumerated in an account book kept by Dutch West India Company officials. Most had left Europe in hopes of bettering their situation in the fledgling Dutch colony of New Netherland. One woman was coming to rejoin her husband, a blacksmith in Esopus. Accompanying her was her 4-year-old daughter. Another man was returning to his home in New Netherland. Every other passenger, presumably, was immigrating to the Dutch colony. In the majority of cases, their place of origin is indicated in the accounts, places ranging from Amersfoort to East Friesland to Liège to Hamburg. 19 people were traveling alone, 17 men and 2 women. The remaining passengers were grouped in 11 family units. 7 families contained a husband, wife, and children, while 3 consisted of a father and children, and 1 a mother and a child. One family consisted of a husband, wife, 6 children, and a nephew. Scrutiny of passenger lists from other vessels headed to the colony reveal that occasionally a servant was attached to a family grouping. The information on these European immigrants to New Netherland was not comprehensive, since not every individual's name was given. Following 17th century custom, the names of wives and children were not noted. Although children's names were not given, their ages were, thus making it possible for genealogists to identify them with the help of baptismal records or family records in the Netherlands or other parts of Europe. The people who crossed the seas on the other vessel, the Moosh, which arrived in 1664, remain nameless. Although we have clues to their origins in Africa, no specific information identifies any African on this ship or in any other vessel carrying slaves. These men and women, in all likelihood captured and enslaved in Africa, embarked on their voyage in Curaçao, a Caribbean island belonging to the Dutch West India Company, and were transported to the company's North American colony as slaves. A few were kept by the company, but most were sold at a public auction in New Amsterdam in May 1664. The record preserved of this auction describes them as Negroes or Negresses, but does not designate them by name. In one instance, there is noted a negress and a child. Those whose names are inscribed on the document are the purchasers of the slaves, a veritable roster of well-known burghers, including Paulus Leanderson van der Grift, Nicholas de Meyer, Isaac Bedlow, and Claudia's favorite, Jacob Leisler. Also carefully noted on this document are the prices paid for the enslaved Africans, prices that bespeak the value that New Netherlanders of European descent attached to the slave newcomers, now fully transformed into human property. The people on de Rosenboom and de Moosh represent the 2 streams of migration to New Netherland over the 40 years of its existence. Yet their odysseys have not been interlaced in the annals of the colony. In a historiography that privileges European colonizers, the subject of immigration to New Netherland has been confined to the transatlantic voyagers, Dutch, Germans, French, English, Norwegians, and others, who sailed directly from Europe to New Amsterdam. The arrival of Africans in New Netherland has been treated as a separate strand of the colony's history, usually subsumed under the topic of slavery. As we commemorate the 400th anniversary of Dutch beginnings in North America, it is time to confront the inequity at the heart of standard accounts of colonization that conceive of European migrants as people and African migrants as commodities. Tellingly, the now authoritative History of New Netherland by Professor Jaap Jacobs includes a long chapter called The Peopling of Such Empty and Unfurnished Lands that focuses exclusively on the characteristics of the Europeans who settled in the Dutch colony. Jacobs reserves his discussion of New Netherlands enslaved Africans for a section of the book called The Periphery of the Community, Jews and Blacks, while also discussing them as objects of religious conversion. In the revised and abbreviated version of this book, now available from Cornell University Press, Jacobs has taken a step toward reconceptualizing the subject of migration to the colony, changing the title of the relevant chapter to Population and Immigration, and inserting a one-page section on enslaved blacks toward the end of it. But his treatment of African immigrants, whom he considers numerically insignificant in the colony as a whole, is perfunctory and does not discern any parallels between the experiences of migrants from Africa and migrants from Europe. By referring to these people as blacks rather than as Africans, he perpetuates the impression that their story is at best a footnote to the historically significant story of the European immigrants who form the protagonists of the chapter. I propose that we make a conceptual leap in our interpretation of the subject of migration to New Netherland and couple the stories of the European and African migrants to the Dutch West India Company's North American colony in one narrative. Examining the patterns of African and European migration to New Netherland in tandem brings into view the commonalities of experience of these two groups of New Netherland pioneers. To think of the African men and women who arrived in the colony not simply as slaves, but as voyagers, whose travel histories were often longer and more circuitous than those of their European counterparts, is a means to disavow the dehumanization of Africans that occurs whenever the linkage between African and slave is made by teachers and students of the early modern world. Reorienting our perspective on the flows of people to the New Netherland colony by charting the ocean voyages of those who journeyed to the North American Dutch colony from Africa with stopovers in Curacao or perhaps Brazil, directs our attention to the pivotal role played by Dutch slave traders in the 17th century Atlantic world. It helps us to understand the alacrity with which New Netherlands European settlers responded to the cues in their environment by seizing the opportunity to participate in the commerce in slaves that stretched from Europe to Africa to the Americas. To satisfy the local company's need for slave labor and subsequently the desire of private individuals for slaves, enslaved Africans were procured in Curacao, the Dutch slave entrepot in the Caribbean, and some even in Africa. By weaving the story of African migrants to New Netherland into the master narrative of its history, and especially that of New Amsterdam, the colony's nerve center, where the great majority of enslaved Africans resided and where their numbers were far from insignificant, the singularity of New Netherlands' development is brought into relief. Steadily increasing reliance on slave labor distinguished New Amsterdam from Boston, for example, where few slaves were found before 1664, the year that New Netherland was ceded to the English. The Dutch colonial city's distinctive demographic profile highlights its biracial character from an early stage. Although historians invariably fix on New Amsterdam's heterogeneity as its defining characteristic, their gaze has too often been trained on the diverse makeup of the European immigrant population. Conceiving of New Amsterdam as a society in which blacks and whites coexisted, albeit on unequal terms, leads us to approach the issue of community building in a fresh light. Judging from the frequency with which Negroes are mentioned in civil and ecclesiastical records pertaining to New Amsterdam, Africans and Europeans regularly mingled in this small urban space of Manhattan. The city became a crucible in which attitudes toward others were formed and reformed as the composition of the population evolved. Reframing New Netherlands' immigration history to incorporate Africans as well as Europeans not only allows us to appreciate the common humanity of all pioneers, but sharpens our perception of how the experiences of the two groups of immigrants varied. The most fundamental difference between African and European immigrants to New Netherland was that Europeans chose to board the ships that crossed the ocean, while the Africans were compelled to climb onto the vessels. In other words, the Africans who came in chains were involuntary immigrants, and the Europeans were voluntary immigrants. Even the orphans who were shipped to the colony by officials in the fatherland had the option of declining to go. New Netherlanders of European ancestry migrated to the Dutch North American colony of their free will. Enslaved Africans, by contrast, had fallen prey to European slavers in Africa, or perhaps a Spanish or Portuguese colony, and were taken to the Dutch slave trading entrepot of Curaçao for reshipment to New Amsterdam. They were captives who found themselves transformed into merchandise. Their experiences sharply differentiated them from voyagers from Europe. Not surprisingly, the demographic characteristics of the African immigrants entering the port were shaped by market considerations. Potential buyers of slaves customarily wanted strong laborers and therefore placed a premium on young men and to a lesser extent young women. However, the economics of the Dutch slave trade were such that New Netherland was not a primary destination for slaves, and buyers there had to be satisfied with slaves who were not saleable in Curaçao or elsewhere. Director General Stuyvesant described the male and female slaves who had been transported to the colony on Demouche in 1664 as, quote, on an average pretty old, and as the skipper alleges, rejected by the Spaniards. Still, I think the majority of enslaved Africans who reached New Netherland must have been relatively youthful, and the women certainly were of childbearing age. In this respect, the age structure of the colony's African population resembled that of the European migrants to New Netherland, who were far from a cross-section of Dutch society, given the fact that older segments of the population rarely emigrated from the homeland. Notwithstanding the similarity of the age structure of these 17th century immigrant populations, particularly this bias toward the young, the composition of the European immigrants differed greatly from that of their African counterparts. Immigrants from Europe tended to come in family units, a fact well documented by historians using the abundant data in the passenger lists and other sources. However, to assume from the void of information on the family background of African immigrants to New Netherland that captive Africans bereft of kinfolk as a consequence of the imperatives of slave trading did not prize family life as much as the Europeans who stripped them of their family ties is, I think, erroneous. In this alien environment, men and women of African descent recreated families once given the opportunity to do so. Families were a welcome anchor for people uprooted from their birth families and their homelands. The records of New Amsterdam's Reformed Church, beginning in 1639, contain numerous examples of slave baptisms and some marriages that attest to the Africans' drive to form and maintain families while under Dutch rule in New Netherland. Their willingness to use a Dutch institution and conform to Dutch religious practices to accomplish their goal is striking, and even more remarkable are their continuing efforts to have their offspring baptized, even after local Dutch ministers virtually halted the practice on the pretext that worldly motives impelled the Africans to seek baptism for their children. This was in the 1650s. The fact that African New Netherlanders had concluded that Christianization was a key step on the road to emancipation does not mean that they were not amenable to the Dutch Protestantism they encountered on Manhattan. Many of these Congolese people had already been exposed to Christianity in its Catholic form in their homelands or in Iberian colonies. The salience of Christianity and the complex of cultural values they brought with them to New Netherland is critical to understanding their adaptation to the variant of Dutch society that developed in the West India Company's colony. As a rule, historians have regarded only European immigrants as capable of importing values and traditions from their homelands to New Netherland. Their intramural scholarly debates have centered on how successfully Dutch culture was transplanted to the colony. By default, African immigrants have been deemed devoid of culture as defined by Europeans and considered mere receptacles for Dutch culture, whether deliberately instilled or casually absorbed. The findings of the specialists in African history concerning the cultural background of West Central African migrants to New Netherland cast doubt on this line of thinking, and by doing so narrows the distance between African and European migrants. Even though much more is known about their lives after they were inserted into the role of slave in New Netherland, the fact that these transplanted Congolese people brought distinctive cultural baggage with them is no longer in question. If the Africans who found their way to New Netherland were not deracinated individuals, but rather bearers of fundamental elements of the vibrant cultures of West Central Africa, as filtered through experiences in Spanish or Portuguese colonies, then the experiences of African and European migrants may have been more analogous than previously admitted. Members of each group came with a cultural compass, which they used to orient themselves to their new environment. Indeed, it is plausible to contend that at least the initial generation of African immigrants to New Netherland were more culturally homogeneous than the Europeans who commanded their labor. The diverse cultures of New Netherland's European settlers can be traced to the flows of European migration to the Dutch colony. Some have argued for the inexorability of the process of cultural blending among Europeans in New Netherland, and particularly New Amsterdam. But a survey of the sources of cultural difference in the settler population suggests that caution is warranted in this respect. The variety of languages spoken in New Netherland is a clue to the diversity of European cultures represented in the colony. Though it may be beyond our power to verify the 18 languages Father Jogues reportedly heard in New Amsterdam in 1644, the documentary record of the colony is studded with references to the varied tongues used by European settlers. Immigrants spoke in the customary languages of their native region, and these languages and dialects provide evidence of their origins in places across the map of Western Europe, the United Provinces, the German states, Norway, Sweden, France, and England, not to mention Bohemia and Italy. Not all who disembarked in New Amsterdam came directly from the Netherlands, and those who did were not all natives of the United Provinces. In the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic was the primary destination for migrants from all over Europe seeking sanctuary from religious persecution or opportunities to better themselves economically. Some of these sojourners in the Netherlands or their children elected to continue their journeys to Dutch America in hopes of improving their economic position. While the majority of New Netherlands settlers of European ancestry came directly from the Netherlands, some came by way of other American colonies. Secondary migration in the Americas is not usually featured in histories of migration to New Netherland, but it accounts for the presence of a good number of the colony's European immigrants. A small number came from other Dutch colonies, as for example those who moved north after Dutch Brazil fell into Portuguese hands in 1654. This included employees of the Dutch West India Company as well as settlers, notably the Jews, who traveled to New Netherland. Others came from Curaçao. But migrants from Brazil and Curaçao or other Dutch American possessions were not the only secondary migrants to arrive in New Netherland. We often forget about the English. The English men and women who founded communities on Long Island in the 1640s and 1650s started out in the neighboring New England colonies of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Dissatisfaction with the decisions made by their town's Puritan rulers in religious matters prompted their exodus, and their settlement in New Netherland occurred at the invitation of Director Willem Kieft. Lady Deborah Moody's Baptist followers, who settled in Gravesend, now part of Brooklyn, are perhaps the most famous example of people who originally were part of the Great Puritan migration and who later cast their lots with the Dutch in New Netherland. In sum, European migrants to New Netherland originated in a variety of towns and cities in Western Europe, including the British Isles. Most migrants were funneled through the Netherlands, but others moved to New Netherland from assorted places in Dutch and British America. Differences among New Netherlands settler populations stem not only from their diverse regional origins, but from their adherence to different religious traditions. The most obvious separation was between Christians and Jews. The vast majority of New Netherlands Europeans were Christians, specifically Protestant Christians, but there were a few Jewish migrants, most coming from Brazil in 1654 after the Portuguese takeover, but a couple directly from the Netherlands. On the passenger list, which are part of your documentary packet, there is actually one of these people, Jacob Bar Simpson, who was a passenger on the Perenboom, the pear tree, in 1654. You can find him if you look on the lists. These Jews, largely Sephardim, have garnered deserved recognition as pioneers, and there is abundant literature on their role in the history of the diaspora in the Americas. In addition, their icy reception from Director General Peter Stuyvesant has elicited much comment from scholars of religious toleration, but their numbers were small and their community transitory. Far more important than the separation between Christians and Jews in New Netherland were the divisions among Protestants. Reformed Protestants from England and the Netherlands shared a good deal in common, and it was Stuyvesant's goal to forge links between these two constituencies, even though they did not have identical practices. It was the Protestants outside the Calvinist umbrella, most notably the Lutherans and the Quakers, who stood as greater obstacles to New Netherland's religious harmony, in Stuyvesant's view. Despite Stuyvesant's concerted effort to bring Lutherans into the Reformed fold by denying them the privilege of public worship, many remained adherents of the Augsburg Confession. Their subterranean Lutheran congregation surfaced in New York City once English governance commenced. Still, there was a common denominator in New Netherland's religious life, Christianity, that bound virtually all the population of immigrants together. The few Jews, of course, are the obvious exception. Remarkably, the earliest generation of Africans and many of their offspring joined with Reformed Protestants in Christian worship in New Amsterdam. Earlier exposure to Catholicism and a growing familiarity with Western religious institutions combined to bring them to the Reformed Church and to motivate them to offer their children for baptism there. Most significantly, it was Dutch Reformed ministers who closed the church door to African New Netherlanders. But this shift in Reformed policy should not obscure the fact that people with roots in West Central Africa and Western Europe managed for a couple of decades to fit under the Christian umbrella in New Netherland. This thread of a common Christianity is crucial to the construction of a unified story of migration to the Dutch North American colony. Everyone in New Netherland, excepting the native inhabitants of the region, and that this is of course a mighty exception, was an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. For far too long, historians imbued with a Eurocentric view of the colonization of Dutch America have treated immigration to New Netherland as synonymous with European immigration, unthinkingly defining immigrants solely as people who chose to come across the ocean of their own volition. For writers whose antecedents lay in Europe and who were inculcated with the notion that an African was equivalent to a slave, placing African migrants who arrived in shackles on a par with European immigrants was inconceivable. Now, 4 centuries after the Dutch colonial project in North America commenced, we are poised to retroactively grant the status of immigrant to scores of people who were brought to New Netherland against their will, captives of colonizers intent on transforming them into commodities. Scanning the records of New Netherland reveals how well documented the lives of people of African descent in the colony are. We can view them at work, at church, in taverns, and once given a measure of freedom as tillers of the soil on their own farms, on land allotted to them by the Dutch West India Company government. Surely it is time to identify these men and women as immigrants and not just as slaves. Thinking of the human cargo that arrived in New Netherland more expansively, as I have advocated in this talk, does not lessen our obligation to contrast the situations of European and African migrants and assess the consequences of the advantages enjoyed by immigrants from Europe. What matters is that we not allow the perceptions of earlier generations of historians, both professional and amateur, to limit our conceptual horizons and dictate who should or shouldn't be considered an immigrant. If we think of each ship sailing into New Amsterdam's harbor as bringing migrants who worked and played, ate and drank, loved and sorrowed, and at least occasionally prayed, we will have a truer picture of the peopling of New Netherland and a firmer foundation on which to graft the history of New York and the nation. Thank you very much.